Computer-generated imagery and animation has come to dominate contemporary film. Once used sparingly by big-budget productions, it is now used across the industry in all manner of shapes and sizes. CGI is now a quintessential part of Hollywood. Here's how and why that's happened. Visual effects have always been part of film history, from early stop motion to simply the power of suggestion in something like Chien, Andalou, where a cow's eye is sliced rather than the eye of a young woman. Many traditional effects are effects in camera, and perhaps a very simple example of an effect in camera is someone pretending to be punched when no physical contact was made. Oh no, it's an earthquake! Too soon? Other classic methods of visual effects might be Ray Harryhausen's Dynamation method, whereby an image of perhaps a stop-motion monster might be sandwiched between a background and foreground action, creating the illusion that the monster is in the same physical space as the other subjects. The stop-motion is a practical effect, and it, like many practical effects, is presented in a way where the visuals have been doctored to convince us of their reality in this movie's universe. Practical effects may well be deceptive, but they do occupy physical space. The model of King Kong really might only be 18 inches tall, but it does occupy physical space. The things in the thing may look very different on screen, but they do exist in reality in some form. Not that thing, the other thing. As with any art, practical effects can be beautiful works of both imagination and engineering, but they have limits. Practical effects can be very clever, but they can't generate a million-soldier army who all move independently and all have photorealistic beards. Maybe practical effects could achieve that with a bottomless pit of money, but really it would be impractical. It would be an impractical effect. I think one of the first examples of three-dimensional digital rendering is important not only because it is the first, but because for such an early example, you can really see the potential in it. Way back in 1960, the Swedish Royal Institute of Technology used a BESC computer to create a 49-second vector animation of a highway, as if the viewer were travelling down it at 110 kilometers an hour. It was broadcast on TV in 1961. I like to think with a little bit of music. I mean, it wasn't, but I like to think that. It was in the second half of the 1960s that other people started to really explore what computer animation might mean for the future of film, and other fields such as design. The University of Utah developed many of the first techniques of using and configuring 3D computer imagery, and much of CGI's later development can be traced back to there. The Russians, of course, were also doing their own things. Nikolai Konstantintov might be credited as the creator of the first computer-animated character. This animation was created using a BESM4, which worked out the algorithm for how the cat should move. Each frame was printed out and filmed in sequence. What's the recipe for creating a computer-generated character, Boris? Well, something recognisable instantly just through its outline. Something cute maybe. A cat. A cute little kitty cat walking along. But don't forget we're Russians and this is the 1960s, so it has to be strangely bleak. In 1968, Charles Kasuri and James Schaffer made the computer-animated Hummingbird. Using 30,000 images, it didn't even have any DLC. Technology became ever more versatile in the 1970s, and that was the decade computer-generated images started to be used in the mainstream. A computer-animated hand, directed and produced by Edwin Catmull and Fred Parke, is often called revolutionary. In it, a hand is digitized. That is, a three-dimensional model of Catmull's left hand was meticulously created from real-life data. A very early predecessor to the digitization of actors we see today in film and video games. Clips from a computer-animated hand were used in the 1976 film Futureworld, itself a sequel to Westworld. Westworld was the first film to use digital image processing, and it was the first computer animation of any kind in a commercial mainstream film. As the film's producer, Paul Lazarus, has said, there were no effects houses around that knew what to do. The effect was really very experimental, and it took a long time to complete, almost delaying the release of Westworld. The effect turned a high-resolution image into one divided into low-resolution blocks, with an average colour in each block. Early pixelation. The 1970s made a number of important leaps in computer animation technology and its use in film. 1974's La Fayim from Canada, a country that has been highly influential in animation and computer animation, was one of the first to use solid colour rendering. What was the first big release where audiences could see wireframe imagery? Well, of course, it was Star Wars. This technique was also used in Alien. Looker was the first feature containing a computer-generated human character, and the following year, Tron famously showcased CGI extensively, and it was the first feature to use such prolonged use of solid CGI. CGI was used far more extensively in the 1980s than in the 70s, and in the 80s a number of new technologies and software began to be used, so that by the 90s CGI began to take a very important place in visual effects work. Both Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park used CGI and practical effects in tandem, and I think these were the first films that began to realise the dreams of the early CGI pioneers. I would argue that the 90s were the transitionary period between CGI being mainly used for either the touching up and manipulation of images, or the creation of cartoony images that weren't meant to be attempts at realism, to the point where CGI began to be used for more important, realistic on-screen components. Robert Patrick melting through metal bars may not look as wondrous today, but it was both an incredible accomplishment for the time, and a success in creating morphing and shape-shifting effects that I would still say can convince. Toy Story was of course the first feature-length CG animation, and 2 years after that, the original Star Wars trilogy was re-released with added CGI elements. Star Wars has of course been meddled with by George Lucas over the years, and here you can see parts of the 2011 cut compared to parts of the 1997 cut. And perhaps Star Wars being altered in 1997 marked the beginning of CGI reaching a level of accessibility where it could be overused. The 2000s and beyond have used CGI in many places, from full feature films to TV to commercials, and I think that decade really saw the rise of CGI being used outside of experimental films, films that were trying to do it first, and really big budget films. Certainly now, some elements of CGI are far cheaper than they were. Maybe not to make a CG character in a photographed movie, but for making components and for making fleeting glances into another realm. The 2000s also saw us reach the uncanny valley, where human characters could be created in a way where a still image of them looked quite real, but on screen they weren't quite real enough to not look weird and creepy. Also, like any new medium, a lot of CGI can become very dated very quickly, or it just looks bad from the get-go.
Not the beast! Ah! Oh, my eyes! My eyes! Ah! Ah!
I don't understand why they couldn't have used real bees and just CGI'd Nicolas Cage's face. Surely that would have been cheaper. The prequel to The Thing, also named The Thing, let's just not, was originally intended to be mostly practical effects. The director made a big deal of it, but the studio didn't like the look of it and had most of those practical effects, which from test footage looked very, very interesting, overlaid with very average CGI that wasn't anywhere near as appealing to most fans of the original The Thing. So CGI can make things look uncanny. It can sometimes make things look not really real, but really fake. And usually it's far more expensive than practical effects, sometimes 2 or 3 times more expensive. So, apart from the technological availability, why is CGI so often used? Well, you could say it's in vogue, but it has been in vogue for a long time, and it does seem here to stay. I think sometimes, maybe not often, but sometimes, it can be a bit of an easy option for a frustrated producer or director in the field. I think it can be easy to say, well, this model isn't working, this isn't the weather that we want, or this is taking too much of our time, let's do it in post. Ultimately, such decisions probably cost productions more money, and probably cost them more time. But then again, perhaps sometimes those decisions are the only viable solutions to problems. However, I think far more often, the main reason CGI is used is because in creative terms, it is potentially limitless. Practical effects can be very clever, and they can be works of art in their own right. Photography and camera movement can portray meaning, but CGI can show a representation of anything that can be dreamt up. Here's special effects artist John Rosengrant talking briefly about the freedoms CGI can offer.
Where we're at now in the effects world is creativity is completely unlimited as to how to approach an effect. It really changes how you design. I mean, the expansion now and freedom to create whatever comes to mind can happen now.
And there is a lot to be said about CGI still working with practical effects in a symbiotic way.
I know Phil Tippett, who was a great stop-motion animator, and then when Jurassic Park came out, it was like, oh my God, this is, what am I going to do now? But he turned those talents of making it perform to the CG. And what I find with the people that work for me is a lot of them started as traditional artists, you know, hands-on sculptors and painters, and then they've converted over to, you know, ZBrush or Maya. And it's not so much the tool, it's still the same art.
ParaNorman was made with computer-generated images being used to print 3D dimensional faces. And most modern stop-motion films like ParaNorman do employ CGI for certain effects and to remove things like set supports. Most people who work in computer animation will tell you that good CGI is the CGI you don't see. The additional backgrounds, the creation of thousands of extras, the amplification of effects like explosions, these can be masterfully created by CGI. And every year, CGI becomes better at things it once couldn't really handle. It can present skin better and humans better. Perhaps the cringeworthy CGI we're no doubt all familiar with really will be consigned to this era of filmmaking as a bit of an oddity. Future generations might ask, did people really believe this was photorealistic? You do sometimes get awful practical effects, just as you do get bad and good CGI. Really, CGI is a tool, and its effectivity depends on who is wielding it. Mad Max Fury Road might be a great example of appropriate use of CGI to bulk out action sequences, and not just the details. 2011's The Thing might be a good example of CGI being used for the sake of using it. And Wolverine's claws in X-Men Origins, Wolverine, are an example of CGI not done right, almost certainly because of time or money or both. But in the long term, I think that CGI will really change the film industry entirely, and that at the moment we've barely scratched the surface. In 50 or 100 years, I really do think that we could see very small teams, or even dedicated individuals, make films that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars today because of CGI. The ability to synthesize images digitally is easier than it ever has been. And not to get too sci-fi here, perhaps with developments in computer learning, in the future, much like anyone can now make a synth track in their bedroom, maybe CGI will open up the same possibility for movies. And I think as well as being very able to depict things that producers and directors want now, it's the wondrous possibilities of computer animation that have made it become so predominant. CGI, I think, isn't only here to stay, I think in the future it will be the main way films are made. Well, those are my thoughts. I'd love to know what yours are. As ever, thank you very much for joining me. Do me a favour and leave a like to help me appease my YouTube overlords, and join me next time where I'll be discussing Blade Runner from 1982 and why it has become so influential over the years. See you then.